Night falls, the earth sleeps. The turf we rest on remains stable and secure until the slumbering giant, sometimes restless, decides to roll over. Author Francis Bacon says this is one of those nights when things in nature sometimes move violently to their place. If we could pick a time for an earthquake, it wouldn't be at night or in the winter, but nature doesn't honor convenience.
Oh, you're in bed already.
Yes, it's so cold tonight. Is that furnace on?
I've taken care of that, don't worry. I'm gonna see if I can finish my book tonight.
I tried to read mine tonight, but I was just too tired.
Well, I'm hoping I can stay awake.
Well, if I fall asleep before you finish, will you make sure that light is out?
Sure. Night.
We smell smoke in a fire. We see rains before the flood, but an earthquake sneaks up on us without warning.
What's going on? What's happening?
It must be an earthquake.
It stopped.
Could we handle the jolt? The reactions in this bit of role-playing hit closer to home than we think. A simple flashlight at bedside, for example, may be a luxury most of us overlook.
Awful.
It's dead. I have to go see what...
Hypothetically, the earthquake packs a lunch, perhaps 7.5 on the Richter scale.
Water running somewhere.
The house, already weakened from the first pounding, could drop more debris from the aftershocks that followed.
Thanks, God.
I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe it.
The kitchen literally is on the floor. Toppled goods from cabinets and broken glassware cover almost everything. Walking, especially barefooted, requires some dangerous sidestepping.
Watch it here.
Oh, ow.
Oh, this door's jammed.
Like some sadistic game of table tennis, nature simply paddled the basement walls.
Can you get out of the way? What do you think it is?
Must be water running.
Oh, do you smell the gas? It's so strong.
Water now pours from a toppled hot water heater, and natural gas squeals from a broken pipe.
What do we do now?
I don't know.
Earthquakes confuse and frighten, whether they happen at night or in the day. This is the real McCoy, not a simulation. A camera captures the ground shaking in progress in Japan. You stop, crouch, become nauseated, and prepare for the worst. October 28, 1983, an earthquake measuring over 7 on the Richter scale rocks the towns of Mackay and Challis, Idaho. The valley floor tilts and drops to one side, breaking the earth here. Violent ground shaking kicks people around like ants on a hill, especially elk hunters sitting a few hundred feet from the fault.
I was sitting down, and when I tried to get up, and it threw the gun out of my hand, and I kept trying to reach for it, and I couldn't get it, so I finally just left it laying. And I just grabbed a sagebrush and hung on because I had a feeling it was going to throw me on my face.
Luana Knox watched from a distance of about 100 feet as nature clenched its fist at Bora Peak. But 2 other hunters were even closer. Don Hendrickson and his friend John Turner sat inside a truck not more than 10 paces from the fault when it dropped.
This whole bank just dropped in front of us and shot up in front of us, and it was like the ground fell out from under us. And we just, it was just like the ground went, and then we went and bottomed out, and the rig just made a loud bang and crash. And then the whole area just kind of was in like a blanket, and it was just rolling like crazy. And I was in the steering wheel just looking at the immediate area, and the Bronco was just kind of going back and forth like this, and I could see John out of my peripheral vision. He was flying up to the ceiling and down to the floor, and toward the end of the quake, he ended up over on top of my arm here, and then he was wedged in between the bucket seats.
The Bora Peak earthquake lasted only 15 to 20 seconds, but those who rode it out thought it would never end.
When we went home Sunday night and talked to my parents and stuff and got a lot of this excitement out of us, and that first night even, or that whole week, I woke up several times in a cold sweat just seeing that bank jump up in front of me like that.
The Idaho quake now represents a model for what many geologists believe is a likely scenario for Utah's Wasatch Fault. Somewhere between the Idaho border, through Brigham City, Ogden, Centerville, Bountiful, Salt Lake, Provo, even south into central Utah, the fault could slip. But this time, instead of two small towns, major cities lie in wait.
We have a large number of buildings that were built from 1900 to 1935 that were unreinforced brick, a lot of wood and concrete construction, but basically unreinforced masonry buildings.
Salt Lake engineer Larry Revely worries about earthquakes in Utah. He stands as one of the state's most prominent advocates of strong codes and quake-resistant building designs.
Many of the institutional buildings built through the 1950s and into the 1960s in a post-World War II building boom, which were built out of light curtain wall, concrete columns, very few walls to brace them against earthquake forces, and as a result they're standing there resisting the wind all right, but that's a far lower force than the earthquake would be.
Hundreds of buildings in Salt Lake City alone could crumble. The bell tower on the Salt Lake City and County building without reinforcement could bounce like a reverse pendulum, even during a moderate earthquake.
We're absolutely convinced that a earthquake in the Richter magnitude of between 5.5 and say 6, which is a highly probable event, could topple the bell tower and drop in on the rest of the structure.
The threatened collapse of Salt Lake's historic landmark prompted this remodeling project. When the big one hits, steel shafts will now hopefully prevent the so-called pendulum swing. We could develop a number of scenarios for an earthquake here. Heavy tremors lasting over a long period of time could topple portions of stronger buildings built before codes. Many walls in the east and west wings of the state capitol, for example, are vulnerable to amplified shock waves. Unlike our simulated two-story house, widespread multi-story buildings like the Capitol react more violently to the poundings of nature. Let's pretend this exaggerated simulation, while unlikely, is possible. We subject our model to a 7.5 or greater earthquake. Decorations and overhangs near the top loosen and crumble. Sectional columns break and fall. The inside floors pancake and collapse as exterior walls peel away. Bits of styrofoam, plaster, and a lot of time and ingenuity. Actors inside a home, pounded by some hypothetical spasms inside the earth. We took some dramatic license here, but hopefully the motive justifies the fantasy. We'll continue in a moment. The Wasatch Fault mimics classic faults throughout the West. During an earthquake, it moves vertically, breaking along fracture lines bordering the mountains on the east side of the valley. It's a series of fault segments running north and south for some 220 miles, but earthquakes usually only fracture sections in 25 to 30-mile lengths. Geologists worry more about those located under heavy population centers from Brigham City to Provo, the home for more than 90% of the state's population. The Salt Lake segment, for example, marks its path with visible scars. Homes straddle this fracture just south of Big Cottonwood Canyon, an extremely large slippage that fortunately broke loose long before we were here. The fault continues west of Wasatch Boulevard. Like the pages of a coloring book, the early morning sun traces the fault with a shadow. It dips slightly west in an irregular pattern just east of the Cottonwood Mall, remaining very close to 13th East as we travel north into the city. This classic bend in the highway at 4th South crosses the fault between 10th and 13th East. We continually straddle the fracture with homes, apartments, and businesses. It's more difficult mapping possible fault traces through the avenues and past the Capitol, but we pick up another scar north of the city, inside the gravel pits near Beck Street. The path continues north into Davis, Weber, and Box Elder counties, and south of the city into Utah County. Besides the Wasatch Fault, others crisscross portions of our turf. The newly discovered West Valley Fault, visible at 3100 South, 3200 West, could also produce a large earthquake. The school here sits on the upside of the fault. The sidewalk and street are below. Many Utahns believe it's okay to live in earthquake country as long as you don't build astride a fault. Misconceptions abound. The Wasatch Fault, while vertical, angles underground to a point almost under the center of the valley. The fault will slip here, but people will feel the strength of the quake directly above the epicenter.
Well, there's one
I think you said that this lower unit was probably 6,000 to 8,000 years old. So we know that all this action has taken place since then. So we've had at least 3 earthquakes, significant ones.
3 large earthquakes in the last 6,000 or 8,000 years. So you would say that they could be perhaps 2,000 years apart. You can see the
geologist Mike Machette and Genevieve Atwood look at a map inside a trench that intersects the fault in American Fork. Trench studies in recent years prove the Wasatch Fault moves historically at regular intervals.
Many places we have evidence of movement that's only 1,000 years old. And if movement occurs on time spans of 1,000 to 2,000 years, then any of those segments could be capable of generating a larger earthquake in the near future. It looks like movement occurs about 6 feet at a time in many places. We've seen this over and over again, sometimes smaller, sometimes larger, but 6 feet is characteristic. And if 6 feet of movement occurs in our time, it'll have a really devastating effect upon the region.
Studies by University of Utah geologist William Perry show a very active fault, one that may have produced as many as 11,000 major earthquakes over a lifetime. According to Perry, that would average out to 1 major earthquake every 1,500 years. Most geologists believe we now sit in an open window for one of nature's routinely scheduled shakeups. State geologist Doug Sprinkle.
So it's hard to say right now. We just don't understand right now to say that this segment here is going to go versus this segment here. Hopefully with the work that we're doing now in the trenches, that it'll help us better understand not necessarily when the next earthquake will occur, but hopefully what segment it will occur on.
The Wasatch Fault will produce a major earthquake sometime, just like Bora Peak did in 1983. This Idaho fault almost mimics the Wasatch Fault. It begins at a depth of 17 to 20 miles, tapering 48 degrees to the surface where it broke ground on that early October morning. Geophysicist Dr. Robert Smith.
So these earthquakes are the only earthquakes in western North America that we can use as a model to predict or develop a scenario of what might happen in a place like Salt Lake City.
Those models assume many faces, including a side effect called liquefaction. The recipe is ripe when you mix an earthquake with a high water table and sandy soil. Brigham Young University's Les Yao demonstrates. A model of the university's Kimball Tower sits on some sands inside this plastic container. Yao raises the water table, then strikes the plastic. The hypothetical shock waves liquefy the one-time stable ground, and the building tips over. These photographs document the real McCoy in Niigata, Japan. The foundations on apartments sank into the liquefied mush, and the buildings fell over intact. Another side effect here involves a condition called lateral spreading.
This is something that we've learned by investigating earthquakes and seeing the kinds of effects that occur. That lateral spreading causes a lot of damage.
Bridges or buildings are compressed as the ground moves horizontally on a liquefied skateboard. What happened in this photograph could happen in many areas along the Wasatch Front, especially Davis County. The 1985 Mexico City earthquake holds another page for our lesson book. More than 400 buildings collapsed, all from an earthquake that began more than 240 miles away. Why did so many structures fail? Mexico City lies in a broad basin, an old lake bottom filled with plastic clays and sands. Sound familiar? Salt Lake City, too, sits on top of an old lake bottom filled with what geologists call unconsolidated sediments. Even though the epicenter of the Mexico quake was almost 250 miles away, the city rocked with incredible force. Hard ground shaking lasted a full 30 seconds. It continued in some areas for almost 3 minutes. Nature taught us a lesson in Mexico City. You can't measure the impact of a quake from size or distance alone. Even buildings constructed from code weakened under the prolonged pounding that never seemed to end. The lake sediments under Mexico City amplified the ground motion, and it continued shaking things through the old lake bottom until buildings that matched the frequencies dropped. It's like hitting a tuning fork. Buildings have resonance too, just like the end of the fork. Match the frequency with some duration, and you shatter the glass. Frequencies include short-period waves, which affect 2- or 3-story buildings, but the long-period shock waves, which traveled some distance to Mexico City, bounced back and forth in the lake bottom sediments until they harmonized with hundreds of tall buildings. The United States Geological Survey recently mapped amplification numbers for Salt Lake sediments. How strong we feel the ground motion from an earthquake depends on where we live. The USGS claims we'll feel the impact 1 1/2 times greater near the eastern mountains, but it increases as we move westward into the lake bottom. Ground motion is more than 5 1/2 times greater in downtown Salt Lake, and as high as 8 1/2 to 10 as we move west past the airport. The unthinkable happened in Mexico City. The lateral acceleration of the shock waves against some buildings 5 to 20 stories high reached a full 1 G in force, nearly 6 times the highest acceleration previously recorded. The impact from sustained ground motion continually outdistanced the code. Mexico City rode wave after wave of ground motion. It sat on a surfboard waiting for the crash. The National Bureau of Standards recently documented classic failures on a computer. The ground motion pounded buildings with wings, flapping them back and forth like branches in the wind. High-rises built too close together hammered each other until the weaker of the two fell. We'll look at some do's and don'ts for earthquake survival when we return. Survival in an earthquake involves a throw of the dice. The game isn't too fair since nature usually calls the numbers. Earthquakes by themselves don't kill, but buildings do. Some grim numbers crop up in the game we may play someday here in Utah.
We're projecting somewhere around 23 to 2,500 people killed initially. That's simply from damaged and collapsed buildings, structures that are sitting astride the fault. We believe that there are going to be over 10,000 people seriously injured, and that's going to put a huge strain on our hospital system.
James Tingey bases the projections on an isolated earthquake with a Richter magnitude of 7.5. It will hit the downtown area hard. Unreinforced masonry buildings over 3 stories could easily collapse. Severed aqueducts will cut off 50% of all water to at least 4 counties. 10 to 15% of all freeway overpasses will collapse. Damage in Salt Lake City alone could exceed $1.5 billion. We seldom worry about all this doom and gloom because most of us have never felt severe ground shaking. Apathy is the byword. Preparedness for us is more idealistic than practical. But it's a different story in California. School kids in Los Angeles prepare for earthquakes, even those who don't know what it really feels like. The Quakey Shaky van routinely visits schools. Kids sit inside a mock classroom and experience simulated shakings based on California's real McCoys.
What we did after we engineered it and put it all together, we put it on a seismograph, and we tested out the 1971 earthquake, and we duplicated the printout that they had over at the seismology lab.
Remember, if Mother Nature gives a shudder, it's like someone shaking your chair.
Most of the fear disappears as the kids listen to Yogi Bear and feel the motion of the room.
We find that in any kind of a trauma, any kind of something that's very dramatic like an earthquake, that the children are terrified, and quite frequently the parents don't have anything comforting to tell them. So by preparing them in an earthquake simulator, they can have the opportunity to see what it's like and learn ahead of time that it's going to be something that they can cope with, that it's understandable, that it's something that's natural.
A comprehensive plan for earthquakes doesn't exist in Utah schools. Only a few hold regular drills. Eastmont Middle School in the Jordan District, for example, sends a coded tone to classrooms. Unlike a fire drill where students orderly evacuate the building, these kids stop and drop immediately under desks or tables to protect themselves from what could be falling debris. It doesn't end here. Once the ground stops shaking, schools must know how to reunite the kids with their parents. Major earthquakes could isolate neighborhoods, even our homes, which are usually immune to a crisis. A home is our castle. We feel safe and secure here. But remember what happened to actors Gene and Carol earlier in this program? The earthquake compromised their comfort at the worst possible time. Our stage couple sidestepped glass and debris barefooted because they didn't keep slippers or shoes at bedside. Gene kept a flashlight near the bed. This practice pays off in any nighttime emergency. We shouldn't become fanatics over all this. It's ridiculous to rearrange a house for an event that probably will happen only once in a lifetime. But take an inventory of high-risk areas. Earthquakes bounce things all over the place, and some of the damage depends on how we secure household goods. Store heavy items and bottles on lower shelves and save the top shelves for the lighter stuff. A box usually cushions mason jars or bottled foods in storage rooms. Valuables are best kept in cabinets with sliders or doors with strong latches.
Good night, Dad.
Heavy items on shelves are risky. Los Angeles schools teach kids how to store soft toys on shelves above their beds. Strong earthquakes shear top-heavy hot water heaters from pipes. They topple unless secured to wall studs with cable or heavy bands. An upright tank preserves valuable water. After the quake, don't use city water. Broken sewer lines could cross-contaminate damaged water supplies. Communication lines usually go down in an earthquake, but don't use the phone even if it's working. Rescue teams need it more than we do. Survey the home and locate shutoff valves and switches. Close the water valve at the main pipe where it enters the house. Shut off the gas at the meter and the electricity inside the main breaker box. Prepare yourself and your house for aftershocks, and don't expect public emergency aid right away.
We like to rely on our 72-hour kit scenario, where we tell people that if you're in an urban area that has received moderate damage, say your house has jumped off its foundation, you don't have electricity, you don't have gas, the phones aren't working, just expect to be on your own for 2 to 3 days.
Mexico City survived its earthquake. Most of the city remained standing. Many families walked away from collapsed multi-story buildings and schools because they followed a few basic rules. We should avoid elevators, which usually malfunction during a quake. People who run outside risk head injuries from falling debris. Power lines are extremely hazardous, so don't seek refuge near poles. We should always move under a heavy desk, table, or door archway. Interior walls often withstand the shaking, while exterior walls and roofs collapse. California paramedics who helped rescue teams in Mexico City claim many people survived because they followed this simple rule.
There were numerous reports of survivors in Mexico City that had heard that if an earthquake happens, you stand in a doorway. And those people were able to get out of the building, and people that did not stand in the doorways did not survive in a lot of cases.
H.G. Wells once wrote, "It's human nature that people do not respond to warnings. But we shouldn't lose sleep worrying about an earthquake. If we build cities in earthquake country over faults that routinely move, we must live with the probability of a repeat performance." Our theme, not if, but when, is not an omen for doomsday. It stands simply as a plea for awareness and preparation.